Hello and welcome. Today we're turning to another hugely important topic in the course, and that's the question of apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was just an amazingly profound system of oppression and racism in the 20th century. Another almost incomprehensible example of the oppression of one group of people by another group of people. And it's a system which formally existed from the 1950s to the 1990s, but which had codified the racial relationships in Southern Africa, which had existed throughout the colonial period as well. We will also consider the social movements of resistance that involved huge numbers of South African men and women and children in seeking to overthrow this system to gain justice and to gain racial equality. And we will also take note of the international support that helped to compel the government of South Africa finally to abandon this system of apartheid altogether. And we will consider all of this history through the lens of Nelson Mandela. But the importance of this story goes far beyond this one truly remarkable man, and yet the history is much, much bigger than this one man. So what was South Africa in the 1950s? First of all, it was an extremely racially divided society. There were, in the end, four legally defined groups: Black South Africans, what were called colored South Africans, Asian South Africans, and white South Africans. The Black population was the large majority, 70% of the population. The colored population was another about 8%. Asians about 2%, and whites about 20%. But whites were completely dominant in South Africa. They had dominated throughout its colonial past, including both Dutch and English colonialism, and they had dominated economically, drawing great wealth from South Africa, but also politically. They had been the politically dominant group. The Black majority of South Africa had little power and lived almost everywhere in poverty. So what was the system of apartheid? It was a very specific set of laws which were enacted in South Africa in the 1950s, restricting and eliminating the rights of Black South Africans, rights of residence, travel, work, political association and expression, marriage and family, social relationships, almost every aspect of life where we would expect to have rights and freedoms. Apartheid restricted or eliminated those rights for Black residents of South Africa. Apartheid was a system of law which embodied in the legal structure of South African society the separation, in fact that's what apartheid means, the separation of the races and racially defined groups in South Africa. And this separation was designed to secure the supremacy, wealth, and power of the white minority. It was a formal legal and political system explicitly founded in racism and white supremacy, and it formally ended in 1994. This photograph is a powerful photograph to me. This is just a vast crowd of Black miners leaving work, streaming out of work, and what the facts indicate is that these miners were paid about a tenth what their white counterparts were paid in the same mines. So what were the living conditions which were in place for Black South Africans? The majority of Black South Africans were forced by law, the laws of apartheid enacted in the 1950s, 51, 52, 53, forced to relocate to Bantustans, or homelands, where they lived in great poverty and were required to live in those homeland areas. Furthermore, the land that was allocated to the homelands, or the Bantustan, were of poor quality, unsuitable to agriculture, and so most residents had no choice but to work in mines and sometimes factories as guest workers outside their Bantustan at much lower wages than white workers. And if you see these photographs, they've been selected to give you a sense of the degree of residential squalor which existed in the Bantustan. This map shows the location of the homelands for the various groups in South Africa in the 1960s. So what were the legal rights which were restricted under apartheid? Almost all of the legal rights of black South Africans were either restricted or abrogated completely. First of all, there were requirements on residence and travel. Black South Africans were required to live in the Bantustans. If they traveled outside, they were required to have a passbook and could be fined or punished if they were traveling outside their Bantustan without a passbook. Political participation in voting, these rights were very limited and were limited to the right to participate in one's own Bantustan, one's own homeland. Black labor unions existed, but they were very restricted and restricted in their ability to negotiate with employers. Rights of speech and association for black men and women were restricted. Marriage and family was restricted. It was illegal for black South Africans to marry outside their racial group, to marry white people, for example. There were explicit laws prohibiting intermarriage. And public facilities were segregated, much like in the American South. It was legally required that black and white South Africans should use separate public facilities. This description, it's a very brief description that I'm offering you, but it's, I think, very important for us in the 21st century to read as much as we can about the history of apartheid because of the depth of this crime against humanity. It is a jolting, appalling, and horrific system of human oppression. Furthermore, it is grounded in a firm and explicit ideology of racial supremacy, racial superiority. It is a system of grinding violent oppression by one group within society by another group for economic and political superiority. In fact, if we're interested in making comparisons, the system of apartheid is on the national scale comparable to the system of slavery in the United States and the Caribbean, in that it is a formal, coercively enforced system in which one part of the population, the black majority, is oppressed and coerced by the minority white population who use the police, the military powers, and the force of law to enforce this system indefinitely. Apartheid is also similar to European feudalism, which came to an end in the 1860s, ironically at about the same time as American slavery, where peasants or serfs were bonded to the soil. They were legally obligated to remain in their residences in the land controlled by their lord, and were forced to work at his command for a part of the, basically a part of the produce which they were able to farm. But I'd like for you to think about the vast human evil which the system of apartheid represents. It's not just a word, it's not just a social condition, it is a vast human evil. It represents the loss of freedom and dignity for millions of human beings, potentially forever. It represents a deprivation of opportunity for individual development and improvement, again, for millions of people, in terms of education, living a healthy life, having an opportunity to pursue economic and job opportunities. It represents an arbitrary use of violence and really unconstrained violence and force against a whole population to enforce unjust and undemocratic rules. It is institutionalized, formalized, and legally enforced system of inequality and racism. It is, in other words, the negation of the ideal of individual autonomy, the ideal of free and full human development for millions of people, beginning with children. It is the negation of the idea of a free and just society. It is instead a racist and unjust society in its very constitution. And the fundamental human realities which this represents are extreme. Again, I think in this course, it's really important for us to try to put ourselves in the position of the individuals who suffered through some of the circumstances that we've been reading about. So I'd like for you to think about what this means for millions of people, millions of individuals, millions of families, millions of children, to live in conditions of extreme poverty, with poor living conditions. Remember those photographs in an earlier slide. Poor nutrition, hungry all the time, malnourished, bodies which are stunted as a result of poor nutrition, poor health, which is the natural, unavoidable consequence of poor nutrition, and the consequence of access to only the most primitive kinds of health facilities. It means also deprivation from educational opportunities. And educational opportunities are exactly what human beings require in order to fulfill their potential to live productive lives. So being deprived of educational opportunity is to be deprived from the opportunity to make a full and decent human life. Limited education was provided in the Bantustan, but it was aimed at preparing people for low-paid, low-skilled, and docile jobs. It was specifically aimed at removing the power that more skilled workers have to withhold their labor. This system meant a complete lack of freedom: where to live, whom to marry, what vocation to pursue, what political party to support. All of those forms of freedom which we take for granted in Western Europe, in the United States, and other countries, those freedoms were absent for Black South Africans. And then there were the consequences of these kinds of deprivation. There are the social dysfunctions which are associated with high poverty, including crime, alcohol and drug abuse, domestic abuse, mental health issues, and the like. Living in the profound lack of hope that would be a very natural reaction to living in a Bantustan under these conditions of poverty. Of course, social dysfunctions are going to be a part of the life that you live. It won't surprise you that South Africa developed its own strategies of resistance. The people, the Black people, the colored people, the other disadvantaged people within apartheid developed their own strategies of liberation and strategies of resistance. The African National Congress, which, interestingly enough, Mahatma Gandhi was one of the founders of the African National Congress, the ANC, in the early part of the 20th century, the 1908, something like that. So the ANC was a liberation organization, a racial justice organization, long before apartheid, but during a period of colonial racism and racial inequality. Organized groups existed in South Africa which struggled for change and struggled against the suppressive order. The South African Communist Party was an active political organization in South Africa, and many of the followers of the ANC had also had experience within the South African Communist Party. The ANC had a strategy which began, anyway, with peaceful demonstrations, mass actions, boycotts, strikes, and acts of civil disobedience. This kind of reflects its origins in a Gandhian idea of striving for social justice through aggressive acts of civil disobedience. In the 1950s, there was an ANC-created effort called the Defiance Campaign, which involved a refusal by followers to accept the laws of apartheid and to then accept imprisonment, a willingness to go to jail. And the idea was that if tens of thousands, if vast numbers of people were sentenced to jail, the system would not be able to accommodate the tens of thousands of people who were convicted of crimes against the apartheid regime. The Defiance Campaign included boycotts, and it's very interesting. We'll talk about this a little more next week, including a bus boycott, which directly inspired, or at least appears to have inspired, the Montgomery bus boycott at about the same time. There were a number of major demonstrations in South Africa in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but two that stand out in history because of their bloody, violent conduct, the conduct of the authorities, the police, the military, The first was the Sharpeville Massacre, March 21st, 1960. There was a large demonstration against the pass laws, the law that each black South African had to carry a passbook and produce it to the police. 7,000 demonstrators marched on the police station in Sharpeville. The police opened fire. 69 demonstrators were killed immediately. More died in subsequent days, including 29 children. So the Sharpeville Massacre was a major turning point in the struggle for racial equality because it kind of cast doubt on the feasibility of a purely nonviolent strategy of resistance. The strategy of civil disobedience and nonviolent noncompliance no longer looked so feasible after the Sharpeville Massacre. 16 years later, the Soweto uprising, June 16, 1976, was an even larger demonstration in Soweto by school children in middle school and high school who were protesting against new laws about the use of the language Afrikaans in their schools. And Afrikaans was directly associated with apartheid, and so the requirement that Afrikaans should be taught in schools was, for these school children, a sign that the intention was that apartheid was forever. 20,000 students participated in marches and demonstrations, and there was a violent response by the police, with at least 176 students being killed. The brutality of this police reaction, this police violence, outraged many South Africans, including whites. It was kind of a Black Lives Matter moment in the 1970s in South Africa. It's also worth underlining that women in South Africa played an important role in the struggle for equality and the struggle against apartheid. There had been a major organized movement going back 50 years before 1953 by women who refused to use the passes, which were required by a whole sequence of pass laws. In 1943, women were permitted to join the ANC, the African National Congress, and they played a major role in the defiance campaign that I was just describing in 1952. In 1955, women once again refused to accept the pass laws. They demonstrated. 20,000 women marched in Pretoria. And throughout this period, the ANC Women's League was an important part of the organization and kind of the motivation and the mobilization of civil resistance by the ANC and by the population of black South Africans. Now finally we're getting to Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela became an important leader in the decades-long struggle against apartheid and for freedom for all South Africans, and he is a truly notable human being. He was a leader of the ANC from the 1940s forward. He was directly engaged in peaceful protests, civil disobedience, and eventually armed resistance against the apartheid government. He became a member and leader of the armed wing of the ANC, which was called the Spear of the Nation, or MK. He was arrested and was convicted of political crimes, including he was charged with treason. He was convicted of sabotage in 1963 and was sentenced to life in prison. And here we have a photograph of him in one of the more notorious prisons where he spent the bulk of his time. But from 1963 until his release in 1990, he spent all of those years in harsh prisons, mostly doing hard labor. Nelson Mandela was a moral example in South Africa. He was an effective leader. And he was released from prison by President F.W. de Klerk in 1991 as a result of both domestic pressure calling for the release of Mandela and also international pressure calling for the release of Mandela and the end of apartheid. So in 1991, Mandela was released at the order of President de Klerk. He was then empowered to negotiate an end to the apartheid regime with President de Klerk. And successfully enough, the primary elements of apartheid legislation were repealed in 1994. Honest democratic elections were subsequently held, and Nelson Mandela was elected president in the first democratic elections of South Africa. As president, he established the first of many examples of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. The TRCs are exercises in restorative justice. It's a topic we've talked about before, but the question of how to heal a population, how to recognize, acknowledge, confront the truth of a past history of abhorrent crimes of one group against another, of specific individuals against other specific individuals, how to recognize those crimes, but also somehow heal society and be able to move forward as a unified society. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions created by Nelson Mandela were intended to permit honest recognition of the crimes of the past and also a foundation for a more harmonious future together as a multiracial, multicultural South Africa. It is important in this struggle to understand that international critics, international institutions, were harshly critical of the apartheid system. As early as 1962, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution condemning apartheid policies. In 1963, the much more powerful UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for an arms embargo against South Africa, and shortly thereafter, a special committee against apartheid was established to encourage plans of action against the regime. So there was international pressure against the South African regime. That call for boycotts against South Africa became a major cause of political activism in the United States in the 1970s into the 1980s. And student movements and union movements in the United States were very active in calling for boycotts against South Africa and calling for other forms of action against the apartheid regime. So we can ask ourselves, what led to the end of apartheid? Was it the charismatic Nelson Mandela? Was it the result of international pressure? I would just like to put it in front of you that it seems that really, more than either of those factors, it was the resolute determination of the black majority in South Africa to win their own freedom. It had become clear to President de Klerk and other white leaders in South Africa that apartheid was unsustainable, that South Africa's future was imperiled by continuing adherence to apartheid. And so President de Klerk negotiated the end of apartheid with Mandela, but he did so in large part because his government recognized that history was ringing the bell for apartheid. This photograph is South Africans celebrating and expressing their joy at the end of the apartheid regime.